Discover the shocking truth about Jim Crow in Texas and how its legacy of racism and discrimination continues to impact African Americans today. Despite progress, unequal access to education, health care, and employment opportunities persist. I'll talk about it coming up. This is KRT, Critical Race Theory. It's not the one they teach in law school, but the one banned in public schools. During the early 1900s, racism and discrimination against African Americans in the state of Texas was rampant. It was a time when the state was grappling with the aftermath of the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. The white population, who held the majority of the power, saw African Americans as inferior beings who were either childlike or savage beasts. This view of blacks was reflected in many aspects of life in Texas, from laws and policies to social attitudes and beliefs. One of the most significant ways in which this view was expressed was through the legal system. During this time, laws were put in place to restrict the rights of African Americans. For example, Jim Crow laws mandated racial segregation in public spaces, including schools, restaurants, and public transportation. These laws were enforced by state and local authorities, and those who violated them could be subject to fines, imprisonment, or even violence. In addition to these laws, there were also policies that made it difficult for African Americans to vote. Texas instituted a poll tax, which required citizens to pay a fee in order to vote. This was a significant burden for many African Americans who were often poor and could not afford the tax. In addition, there were also literacy tests which were used to disqualify African Americans from voting. These tests were often rigged, and even those who could read and write were frequently denied the right to vote. Welcome to Jim Crow 1.0. Social attitudes toward African Americans were also deeply ingrained during this time. Many whites believed that African Americans were intellectually inferior and incapable of self-governance. They saw blacks as childlike and in need of white supervision and control. This attitude was reflected in the way that African Americans were treated in public spaces. For example, they were often required to use separate facilities such as drinking fountains and restrooms, and were denied access to many public spaces altogether. At the same time, however, many whites also saw African Americans as dangerous and threatening. They viewed blacks as savage beasts who were prone to violence and criminal behavior. This attitude was reflected in the way that African Americans were policed and punished. Many blacks were arrested and jailed for minor offenses, and they were often subject to harsher penalties than whites for the same crimes. Overall, the view of African Americans as either childlike or savage beasts was a pervasive and damaging aspect of life in Texas during the early 1900s. It was reflected in laws and policies that reflected the rights of African Americans and social attitudes that perpetuated racial inequality. While progress has been made since then, it is important to recognize the legacy of racism and discrimination that continues to affect African Americans in Texas and across the United States today. Here's the way it affects blacks in Texas today. In Texas, black individuals face systemic racism in the criminal justice system, education, housing, employment, and other areas. Black individuals in Texas are more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested by law enforcement compared to their white counterparts. The use of excessive force and police brutality against black individuals is also a significant problem. Black individuals in Texas are often discriminated against when seeking housing. The landlords and property managers may refuse to rent or sell to black individuals or charge higher prices and fees based on race. Black individuals in Texas often face discrimination when seeking employment. They may also be passed over for jobs or promotions due to their race, and may also face unequal pay and other forms of mistreatment in the workplace. And Black individuals in Texas may be subject to racial profiling, which involves the use of race or ethnicity as a factor in deciding who to investigate or stop. This can lead to unnecessary harassment and criminalization of innocent individuals. There you have it, Jim Crow 2.0. This has been Critical Race Theory. Thanks for checking in. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and share this video with your friends and family. I'll see you next time.